Welcome back to Nonstop Politics. I'm your host DK Leslie, and today we have to check back in with the state of the pandemic in the UK, because at the moment things are not looking good at all. Case numbers and hospitalisations have risen significantly from where they were just a month or two ago, and now with autumn upon us and winter fast approaching, time is now ticking to get the virus back under control as people begin to move indoors to escape colder temperatures, which of course gives the virus the best chance of spreading. Coming up, a quarter of the UK population is now under some form of local lockdown. So there is another national stay-at-home order on the horizon. Plus, the four nations once again diverge on their approaches to reimposing restrictions, so why could this be beneficial to the Scottish First Minister in the long term? And some Conservative backbenchers show unease with the PM's rule of 6 as calls grow for increased parliamentary scrutiny of the government's pandemic plans. But just how many Conservative backbenchers are prepared to rebel against the government? I'll give you the answer to that a little bit later on in the episode. But first, it's back to campus season, with many students, including myself, returning to university for the start of the new term. Things are much different, of course, at this time, with many induction events, nights out, and overall fresher stuff just completely off the cards this year due to the global pandemic. But despite these changes, it seems that things have not gotten to the best of starts, with some universities already seeing significant outbreaks of the virus on their campuses. Now, before I get into the specifics of this, it's worth pointing out that the issue of university students heading back to campus has been in the news a lot over the last month or so. We've had the University and College Union in particular having quite a lot to say about this at the end of last month. General Secretary Jo Grady caused quite a stir when she said that, quote, universities could become the care homes of the second wave of coronavirus. Now, her point there being that all students should not return to campus until after the Christmas break, and all teaching and learning should be conducted online, because at the moment it's far too dangerous to have so many students cramped into halls and on campus in large groups. Now, you couple that with a testing system that was and is still under some strain, and you've got yourself a recipe for disaster. That's her argument. Now, at the time, these calls by Grady to shut down universities and move everything online were met with quite the backlash, not just from certain outlets who accused unions of being up to no good again and playing games, trying to make life as difficult for the government as possible, but also from the universities themselves. They've been going through a very tough time as well. They need to be able to keep their courses going, so their modus operandi throughout has been to take a blended learning approach, a mix between some small in-person seminars and with online lectures in larger groups taking place. So they want to make sure that that's able to happen and give students the best of both worlds. So that's their plan for tackling this, and that is evidently what they've done, because of course this month thousands of students, including myself, have either moved to or returned to university. Unfortunately though, Jo Grady's prediction of a spike in cases has come to pass, because we've seen significant outbreaks taking place at several universities. According to BBC News, Glasgow University has seen 172 positive cases so far, and as a result, 600 students have now been told to self-isolate. In Dundee, all 500 students at the Parker House halls have been told to isolate, and in Edinburgh, 120 cases have been detected at Napier University. Now, we're seeing this most in Scotland at the moment because they went back earlier in September, but now we're also beginning to see similar outbreaks take place elsewhere across the UK, especially in England. So Manchester Metropolitan now has 2 of its halls of residence in lockdown after 127 students tested positive there. 1,700 students in total are now in isolation, and the University of Liverpool has confirmed that 87 new cases have been detected. And look, these are absolutely horrifying numbers, especially the English numbers, considering that teaching hasn't even begun at most universities in England. And so now this leads us to ask 2 big questions. First, what explains the sudden increase in cases? And second, what could it possibly mean for Christmas? Because there have been minutes from SAGE meetings, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, that have either been leaked or are due to be released, which have reportedly recommended to ministers that students may need to stay on campus during the Christmas period. That obviously sounds quite dramatic, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment, but let's tackle this first issue. Why the sudden increase in cases? I think the simplest explanation here is that, look, you've got a lot of freshers who have just arrived at uni. They simply want to have fun, have secret underground house parties, live the YOLO lifestyle and all that, and they think they can take the risk for themselves. This is obviously hugely irresponsible and reckless, incredibly dangerous, putting other people's lives at risk. But here's the dilemma from where I stand and my perspective, because I'm a final year student. I've already had 2 years of the normal university life, 2 years of lectures, seminars, nights out, house parties, the lot. So it's very easy for me in my final year, especially as everything now gets serious with the dissertation and that kind of thing, easy for me to just say, everyone should do what I'm doing this year, which is staying at home 90% of the time, not seeing friends that often, certainly not mixing with other households, especially as I live in Leicester, which is under stricter rules than where I was for most of the summer back in the capital. And, Leicester is deemed to be a very high-risk area. So I, because I'm a final year student, really don't need to take all these risks, because I already have friendships from uni, I've done all the uni stuff that people come to uni to do in the first place, and so I can easily suck it up and accept the situation and move on. But put yourselves in the shoes of a fresher for a moment. First of all, many of them will have already had a horrid summer with the total disaster, the total catastrophe that was A-level results day, with a ridiculous algorithm marking down many of their grades, literally for no reason whatsoever. And that was a scandal in of itself, and the government had to backtrack and all that, but I digress. The fact is that students who had already been through that had their morale knocked substantially. And even if things during their first year weren't going to be as they'd initially hoped it would, moving to university for the first time is still a big deal. New city, new ways of working, new friends, even if hanging out with them will be different. So for them, they might be thinking, well, why not have a little house party here and there to get everyone in a good mood? Why should we have to sacrifice our experience after we've been thrown under the bus by the government? Some of us have had to make sacrifices ourselves during the pandemic as well. Some of us have been working throughout, volunteering, being in care. So we should be able to have our own fun too. That's what some of these freshers might be saying. Couple that with the fact that many feel that the government for the last couple of weeks has actually been increasingly blaming young people for the increase in cases, and you could be seeing a little bit of resentment there too. And if all that wasn't enough already, now try telling those same students who've had an awful summer, who are now having to isolate in these little pockets of outbreaks, try telling those same students that they should also have to stay on campus over the Christmas break. I mean, to say that a decision like that would be unpopular would be the understatement of the year, and yet the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has not ruled it out. But here's the thing. While students may not be in favour of such a move, and even someone like me would prefer to do a simple 10 to 14 day quarantine at the end of term, despite all of that, when you look at the science of how the virus spreads, a policy like this makes absolutely perfect sense. Scientifically, it is actually pretty sound, because you have a lot of young people who may not be the best observers of social distancing, whose natural instincts might be to want to mingle, who might want to travel back home to their parents and grandparents and other vulnerable relatives across the country. That would be an absolute recipe for disaster. We have to be honest with ourselves here. That is if mitigations are not put in place. And I do think that both the government and universities can act now to make sure that such a move, if it's made, does not have to be so dramatic. I just gave the example of possibly giving students a chance to self-isolate for 10 to 14 days at the end of term before heading back home, so that they know that when they left uni they were not infectious. The other thing that universities could do to bolster that is to offer testing to students. So they could ramp up their testing, give students a chance to take a couple of tests in the week before that they leave for university, so that they have the medical certainty that they will be negative. And I know that some universities are already working on their in-house programs, including my own, which is definitely reassuring. But especially at Christmas, it would be extremely helpful to those students and their families. But look, we are where we are. On the whole, it's going to be an incredibly tough term and academic year for students and professors alike. But the most important message, really and truly, during this first term and beyond, is to follow the government guidelines, follow your university guidelines, practice social distancing, wear masks, have diligent hand hygiene, and just limit your interactions with other households. I know it will be tough, especially for freshers, but if we all play our part, hopefully things will return to normal sooner rather than later. So let's briefly touch on the widespread local lockdowns that are increasingly being imposed across the UK. BBC News has got a comprehensive list of areas which are under restrictions. A link to that will be in the show notes for this episode. But let me give you some key highlights from this, because at the moment, almost 16 million people are now under some form of local lockdown. That's almost a quarter of the UK population. That includes 12 million people in England, 1.5 million people in Wales, and 1.8 million people in Scotland. Huge numbers of people that are involved. Now, inevitably, politics is going to play a big part in that. You know, this podcast is called Nonstop Politics because that is what we're all about here. And I'm afraid we have to really dive into what is at stake here, because look, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson brought in a set of tighter restrictions to combat the rising cases that we've been seeing. 6,000 cases per day, well over 6,000 cases per day, have been reported in the last few days. So clearly, action had to be taken by the government. So on Tuesday, the Prime Minister announced that hospitality venues would have to be operating on a 10 p.m. curfew. Office staff should now work from home if they can. That advice changing from the government encouraging employees back into the office earlier last month. And face coverings are now going to be mandatory in more places, and more people will have to wear them. That includes staff who work in retail, so they will now have to be wearing their face coverings as well. All of these measures are being introduced to slow the spread of the virus, bring case numbers down, and ultimately avoid a second national lockdown. And Boris Johnson specifically, in his speech to the Commons, said that this was not a return to March's general stay-at-home order. But notably, the government have not ruled out taking such a step if it was deemed necessary. Now, that's obviously a last resort, given the severe economic damage that it did last time round, economic damage and, of course, damage to people's well-being and way of life. So that's something that the government does want to avoid. But the very interesting thing here, the key political dynamic here that we saw play out, really is between Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon. On Monday, we had a briefing by England's Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, and England's Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, where they give a very bleak picture of the situation right now. They projected that the UK could see 50,000 cases per day by mid-October if the virus was left to get out of control. But despite this bleak picture being painted, the Prime Minister's new lockdown measures did not go as far as many people had expected. And that's partly due to resistance from backbench Conservatives, which I'll come to in a second. But nonetheless, these measures, while significant, they had some wanting more. In fact, YouGov polling done right after the Prime Minister's primetime address showed that nearly 45%, half the country almost, thought that the Prime Minister should have gone further with new COVID restrictions. So why am I making this a big political point? Well, it's because of what Nicola Sturgeon would do right after Boris Johnson's address. Because, unlike Boris Johnson, she saw the need to go much further in her restrictions. She announced that she'd be taking measures much further by expanding the ban on household visits already in place in Western Scotland to the rest of the country. Her statement read in part, quote, "Today must feel like a step backwards, but by staying out of other people's houses for now, we give ourselves the best chance of bringing COVID back under control." Worth pointing out as well that Northern Ireland had already introduced exactly the same household measures across the population back on Monday. Now, yes, it's true, Nicola Sturgeon has gone for the 10 p.m. curfew as well. She's keeping schools open too, but this is a fascinating move by Nicola Sturgeon, something that we've seen before from her actually, and the government in Holyrood, where they have been making very significant policy decisions that differ from Westminster, only for Westminster to then copy that policy sometime later. Think the U-turn on face masks, the U-turn on exams, and that kind of thing. This time, though, the difference in policy is so stark and very material, because after a few weeks, we are going to find out just how effective the ban on households has been in stemming the spread of the virus, and if it has been successful in curbing the number of cases, then Sturgeon will once again have shown that despite taking the tough decisions, she has shown the right judgment and leadership for her country, while bumbling Boris has once again left it too late to make the difficult decisions that need to be made. Remember, we're heading into the Scottish Parliamentary elections in May. The pandemic has largely been viewed as being handled very well by the First Minister, mainly because she's shown leadership on this issue. And don't forget the all-important I word, that is at stake in May's elections, and if Sturgeon can demonstrate her competence against Boris Johnson, the SNP may end up winning a majority in Holyrood, which once again puts the future of the union in jeopardy. But I'll have more to say on that particular issue when we get to it next year. There are some 40 Conservative MPs that are preparing to rebel against the government's renewal of the Coronavirus Act, which has reached its 6-month renewal point. Now, this is amid growing unease that Parliament is not having enough of a say over the measures that the government's taking vis-a-vis the restrictions that are being imposed on people's lives. Now, if you cast your mind back to March, there were fears that Parliament would not be able to sit for a very prolonged period of time because of the pandemic. But after the Easter recess, Parliament was able to sit virtually, and now more MPs are back in the chamber, 50 at a time, social distance of course. So, the argument goes that now there's a lot more room for more parliamentary scrutiny of the government's actions. There's much concern among some Conservative MPs that the Prime Minister is going way too far with coronavirus restrictions, with the chair of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, a very important person in the Parliamentary Party. He has argued that ministers have, quote, got into the habit of ruling by decree and criticised the, quote, imposition of the rule of 6. Specifically, he mentions the fact that Parliament would have had the opportunity to ask the government to explain why children were included in the rule of 6 indoors in England, as opposed to Scotland, where under 12s don't count. And that is actually a very good point that Sir Graham Brady makes, because especially with all the U-turns and exemptions and loopholes that are sometimes found in these laws, parliamentary scrutiny to ensure that these are the right decisions for the country is extremely important. On the other hand, though, we're in a global pandemic, it's a national emergency, and it's a fast-changing situation, as we've seen over the last 6 months. And, the government's getting direct advice from the scientists here, scientists and medical experts. So shouldn't we trust what the experts say and rely on the government to make policy that goes along with that? Wouldn't there be a danger in a scenario such as Chris Whitty having to call for another national lockdown because the virus is out of control, but then having such a move interrogated so much and blocked even but in Parliament because of a few Tory backbenchers that are worried about the freedom of their constituents to go grouse shooting, for example? I mean, that might be a bit of a dramatic example, but you see my wider point here. A lot of MPs just don't want to see further measures taken because of the damage that it will, of course, do to the economy and people's way of life. But the problem with that is, A, it may put people's lives at risk, and B, these MPs could actually be out of step with the country. As I said to you before, almost half of Brits wanted the Prime Minister to go further in imposing restrictions. So, look, there are definitely the pros and cons to both approaches with involving Parliament. Everybody across the political spectrum wants the best for the people of this country, and next week we will find out exactly the way in which that process will work legislatively for the next 6 months of the pandemic. Thank you for listening to Nonstop Politics. If you enjoyed, why not follow us on Instagram @NonstopPolitics, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.